So what is the solution to Brexit?
If this didn't work, okay, if we reach the worst case scenario of no deal being on offer, no deal is better for us than the rotten deal we've got now.
Because we made a terrible mistake.
Is that there is nothing to fear from a clean break.
One of the Cabinet's leading Brexiteers has suggested that voters can use the next general election to have their say on a final deal with the European Union and to force a future government to change course if they don't like what's been agreed.
So, if we want to find a solution, we first have to diagnose the problem. Remainers still want to remain, leavers still want to leave, but leave won. Nobody can decide how we leave. Normally, we make decisions in elections and parliament, and sometimes referendums. But the election last year made decision making for the government harder because Theresa May lost seats. And so now, Parliament is too divided on the issue of Brexit, with no clear majority in support of the government, but also no clear alternative solution from an opposition side or party fraction, because even the Tory Brexiteers don't have enough members, sitting at about 80 compared to the rest of Parliament. But there isn't a clear question to ask in a referendum that would solve the issues and not create further problems, such as whether an option to remain after years of trying to leave should be included in that second referendum. So what is the solution? So Britain is broken, the country is sick, and something needs to be done. But as with any sickness or injury, there are three options: riding it out, preventing it ever happening at all, or curing it completely. So let's just say we chose to ride it out.
And so what we have instead of that in front of the country is the Chequers compromise. Can I ask you, if that goes through, big if it happens, if it's brought back and voted on, is that permanent or is it a temporary solution?
No, I think it's the right answer. No, the one thing,
So
of course,
permanent.
well, yeah, but there's one critical thing. A future Prime Minister could always choose to alter the relationship between Britain and the European Union.
Riding it out involves letting the government and Parliament fudge together some kind of deal they negotiated with the EU and accepting it. Michael Gove has suggested that a then future government could change the terms of that deal. It might even mean holding secret ballots to get things through Parliament. Riding it out involves a short, sharp pain of people very angry with whatever the establishment come up with. Remainers angry that we're still leaving, Brexiteers angry that we're not leaving enough. But at least the job can get done quickly, allowing more time to move on to other areas of politics. A fudge deal either threatens forgotten parts of the economy they didn't negotiate, or it leaves the UK facing decades of hung parliaments and political instability in the years to come. So what about preventing it ever happening?
Do you support a second referendum?
Well, I think if the deal the Prime Minister comes back with in October is rejected by Parliament, everything's on the table, including another vote.
Jeremy Corbyn
has
has made it absolutely clear that there's not going to be a second vote.
Well,
he said it to us last week.
Because we're talking in hypotheticals, let's wait and see what happens with the deal the Prime Minister comes back with. If it's so bad that Parliament rejects it, there are two options: a general election or a referendum.
This doesn't mean remain. So a computer which is turned off and then back on again often runs better. So just because we prevent it now, delay it, put it on hold and wait for something else first, doesn't mean we can't still go through the process of leaving the EU, just more slowly and carefully at a later date. This is the risk assessment option. So how do you prevent Brexit? Well, you could extend the time we have to negotiate Brexit, which makes it easier to make a better deal for the UK and the EU. We could call a general election, which makes it easier for the country to decide which party's response to the Brexit negotiations they wanted, but it would probably end up in a hung parliament. Or we could hold a second referendum. So I've talked about this twice now, so I'm not going to go into the referendum itself, but let's just assume somehow some future Prime Minister said, Brexit is cancelled. We're remaining in the EU. Anger and riots would be the reactionary emotion from the Brexiteers. But if it's stuck, then either we'd get used to being in the EU, or more likely, a mass movement of leavers would wipe through the political landscape, making way for a much better, much more measured and more thought out version of Brexit. Or the country might never be able to decide a version of Brexit anyway, and therefore we never leave on that basis. But what about curing it completely?
There's been no shortage of dire warnings of what a no-deal Brexit could do to the UK economy. But one the BOE Governor Mark Carney reportedly gave to government ministers could be the worst in recent months. The Times newspaper says he briefed them on a possible property market crash, with spiralling mortgages and house prices falling a whopping 35% over 3 years.
They say prevention is cheaper than the cure. If we didn't fudge a deal through, most likely the cure would need to come anyway, even if we tried to prevent Brexit. If leavers still wanted to leave, we would need to find a way of making a version of Brexit everyone can agree on. Of course, in the medical world, new pills aren't handed out until after experiments and trials. Brexit does have economic and political side effects, so we know the hazards. All we need to do is to decide what to do to control the risk, by who, and by when. So the economic risks of Brexit. Leaving the customs union and single market is a huge change to the UK economy. Not being seen as a bigger player in the world stage because we're no longer part of the EU, we might face a lack of immigrants to do certain jobs, and businesses might choose to operate in the EU where it's easier to trade with other nations. But you can prevent the economic risks of Brexit. For example, when it comes to leaving the customs union and single market, you could simply say that we don't leave immediately in order to measure that risk to the economy. And of course, you could try and negotiate as much access to the customs union and single market as possible, so very little changes in that regard. If you're worried about not being seen as a bigger player in the world stage, then just make lots of new trade deals and become an even bigger player than the EU. If you're worried about a lack of immigrants to do jobs, then just supply immigrants where needed, such as the NHS. And if you're worried about businesses choosing not to operate in the UK, then just make it easier for businesses to set up shop in the UK. But with Brexit, the economic risks and the political risks face each other head on. More immigrants equals more anger from those Brexiteers. Not leaving soon enough creates uncertainty. We might end up giving up sovereignty and independence to other nations in desperate trade deals. Sovereignty and independence is why we voted in the first place. And there is a huge potential for losses of jobs. But it's okay, you can mitigate the political risks. You can put a number on the amount of immigrants you let in. You can put a specific date on leaving so we know for certain when we're leaving, and it gives reassurance to those Brexiteers that we will leave. You can keep the UK's principles and not give in when making trade deals. And just because we lose jobs in some areas does not mean that we can't create new jobs in new areas. When does this all need to be done by? As soon as possible. By who? The current government, because it needs to be done as soon as possible. And there you have it. You've got something that sounds very similar to the Chequers deal, in which we try to prevent Brexit, we cure it, we fudge it, we try to prevent Brexit again, we cure it, we fudge it, and it goes on, and on, and on, and on. What's begun with Brexit is a never-ending cycle of dissatisfaction, but that doesn't mean that we can't live with our disability. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.